The evening air carried a gentle breeze from the ocean. The city lights of San Diego painted the streets in soft yellow and orange. People walked in groups, laughing, talking, some heading home after a long day, and others stepping into the night to enjoy a few hours of freedom. Among the glowing neon signs that lined the busy street stood a bar known to many service members. It was the kind of place where uniforms mixed with leather jackets, where stories were told in quiet corners, and where friendships often began with a casual hello over a cold drink. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and lively. The soft golden lights reflected off polished wooden tables. Music played in the background, not too loud, just enough to give the night a rhythm. The scent of grilled food mixed with the faint aroma of coffee and citrus, creating a feeling of comfort that made people want to stay. A Marine colonel walked through the door, adjusting his jacket as he stepped in. He wasn't in uniform tonight, but anyone could tell by the way he carried himself that he had spent many years in service. His posture was straight, his movements calm and steady. He had the quiet confidence of a man who had led people through hard times and earned their respect. He walked to the bar counter and ordered a simple drink. He didn't need anything fancy, just something to relax with. As he waited, his eyes scanned the room the way they always did. It was a habit he didn't even notice anymore. That was when he saw her. She sat alone at the end of the bar, not trying to draw attention to herself. She wore a leather flight jacket that looked slightly worn but strong, the kind that had seen many places and carried many stories. Her hair was tied back neatly, and there was something striking about the way she held herself. She didn't look nervous or shy. She looked like someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. The colonel couldn't explain why, but something about her made him pause. There was no loud laughter around her, no group of friends. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. Yet, she was impossible to ignore. The bartender placed his drink on the counter. He picked it up but didn't take a sip. His eyes returned to her. She was sipping her own drink slowly, watching the people around her with quiet curiosity. After a moment of thought, he walked toward her. "Is this seat taken?" he asked politely. She glanced up, gave a small smile, and shook her head. "No, it's not." He sat down beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. For a moment, they sat in silence, listening to the music and the soft sound of people talking around them. "You don't come here often, do you?" the colonel said finally, his tone friendly. "Not really," she replied, her voice calm and even. He nodded. "Yeah, I can tell. Most people here either come in groups or they talked aloud after their first drink. You don't look like either of those." She gave a quiet laugh. It wasn't loud, but it had a warm, easy tone. "I guess I don't," she said. The colonel leaned slightly on the counter. "So what brings you here tonight?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at her glass as if she was thinking about whether she should tell him. Finally, she said, "Just needed some air and quiet." He smiled. "Well, this place isn't exactly quiet, but I get what you mean." Another pause. This time, it didn't feel awkward. It felt like the kind of silence between two people who didn't need to rush anything. The colonel finally asked the question that always seemed to come up in places like this. "You serve?" She tilted her head slightly. "Yeah, Marine." He asked. She shook her head. "Not Marine. Air Force." She didn't say yes or no, just took another slow sip of her drink and let the question hang in the air. The colonel chuckled softly. One of those answers." She gave him a half smile, like someone who had been through many similar conversations before. He extended his hand. "I'm Carter," he said. She shook his hand lightly. "Nice to meet you." "Colonel Carter," she replied. He raised an eyebrow. "I didn't say Colonel." She smiled again. "You didn't have to. I can tell." That made him laugh out loud, something he didn't do very often. "All right, fair enough," he said. They talked for a little while about the city, about the weather, about the way people seemed to come to this bar to breathe after long weeks. Nothing serious, nothing too personal. She spoke carefully, like someone who didn't reveal more than she wanted to, but her voice had a calm strength in it, something steady and grounded. Then came the moment that changed the night. "So, Carter said casually, "What's your call sign?" She stopped mid-sip. She placed the glass down slowly and looked at him. Her eyes were steady, not cold, but strong. "Why do you want to know?" she asked lightly. "It's just a habit," he said with a friendly grin. "Whenever I meet a flyer or someone from a unit, I ask their call sign. Kind of a tradition, I guess." For a few seconds, she didn't say anything. She just looked at him. The music played softly in the background. A group nearby laughed over a shared joke. Then she said, very quietly but clearly, "Phantom 7. The words hit Carter harder than he expected. He froze for a moment, the sound of her voice repeating in his head. His fingers loosened around his glass, and it slipped from his hand, hitting the counter with a soft clink before someone quickly caught it. His mind raced. Phantom 7. He had heard that name before, not just once, but many times. It wasn't a name people used casually. It was whispered in certain circles. Stories were told in quiet corners, never fully confirmed but always respected. He looked at her again, his expression shifting from playful curiosity to something much more serious. "You said Phantom 7, he asked slowly, almost as if making sure he hadn't misheard. She nodded calmly. For a moment, Carter didn't speak. His mind was filled with memories of briefings, mission reports, and conversations that always ended with someone saying, "But no one really knows who Phantom 7 is." There had been stories about missions that seemed impossible, carried out with precision and skill. Stories about someone who flew in and out of dangerous places without leaving a trace. Someone who never showed their face, never took credit, and never wanted the spotlight. Phantom 7 wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend. Carter sat a little straighter, suddenly feeling like he was sitting next to someone far more important than he had realized a few minutes ago. "Wow," he said softly. "I didn't think Phantom 7 was real." She smiled faintly, not in a proud way, but in a quiet, knowing way. "Most people don't." He shook his head slowly. "I've heard stories. A lot of stories. But nobody ever said your name. Nobody ever even said if Phantom 7 was a man or a woman. That's the point," she said simply. The colonel felt something he didn't feel often: true surprise. He wasn't the type to get starstruck. He had met generals, pilots, heroes. But Phantom 7 was different. It wasn't just a person. It was a name wrapped in mystery and respect. He leaned slightly closer, not out of disrespect, but in quiet admiration. "Can I ask, why the name?" She tapped her fingers lightly on her glass. "I didn't choose it. Someone gave it to me." "Why?" "Because I was never where they expected me to be," she said with a gentle laugh, like a ghost. Carter laughed too, though he still couldn't quite believe what was happening. She turned back to her drink, as calm as before. She didn't seem impressed by his reaction. She didn't seem to want attention. It was just a fact of her life, like her name, like her jacket, like the way she breathed. The colonel's mind kept going back to the stories he heard. Years ago, during a tense period overseas, there had been a mission everyone thought was impossible. The team on the ground had told stories afterward about a pilot who appeared out of nowhere, completed the mission perfectly, and disappeared again like wind over sand. That pilot had been called Phantom 7. He never thought he'd meet the person behind the name while sitting in a quiet bar. On a simple evening, she noticed the way he was still looking at her and smiled lightly. "It's just a call sign." "Colonel," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, it's not just a call sign. Maybe not to others," she said, "but to me, it's just part of the job." He watched her for a moment, trying to understand how someone who carried such a name could speak with so much calm. There was no pride in her voice, no need to impress, only quiet certainty. Other people in the bar went on with their night, unaware of what had just happened. But to Carter, something had shifted. He realized he was sitting next to someone who had shaped moments in history without ever asking for credit. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. "Sure," she replied. "Why stay in the shadows? You could have taken the spotlight. People would have celebrated you." She looked at him for a moment before answering. "I never did it for celebration," she said. "And shadows can be peaceful." He nodded slowly. He understood that in a way. For the next few minutes, they didn't talk. They just sat there. Two people with very different paths, sharing a quiet corner in a busy bar. She sipped her drink, her posture as calm as ever. He sat beside her, still processing the weight of what he had just learned. It wasn't the kind of story that needed music or applause. It was something quieter, something real. The night outside continued like nothing had changed, but for Carter, the world had just gotten a little bigger. He had seen a name come to life, a name that had only ever been a whisper. And she, the woman behind that name, was sitting quietly beside him, just as unassuming as she had been when he first saw her. Phantom 7. She was not a headline. She was not a story told to impress. The Colonel sat still for a long moment, almost forgetting the noise of the bar around him. The music played, people laughed, glasses clinked, and the soft hum of conversations continued. But in his mind, everything had gone quiet. He was still trying to believe what he had just heard. She, the calm, quiet woman sitting next to him, was Phantom 7, the name that had traveled through so many circles, wrapped in mystery. The name people spoke of with respect. She wasn't wearing any medals. She wasn't surrounded by admirers. She was just sitting at a bar, drinking quietly, like any other person who wanted a peaceful night. The Colonel finally found his voice again. "I've heard about Phantom 7 for years," he said softly, almost to himself. "But I never thought I'd meet the real person." She smiled gently. "Most people don't." Carter shook his head, still amazed. "You have no idea what that name means to some of us." She tilted her head slightly, as if she'd heard that kind of comment before. "I think I do," she said. "But that's not why I ever did anything." He leaned back slightly, studying her face. There was something about the way she spoke that made every word feel honest. No arrogance, no drama, just quiet truth. "You must know the stories that go round about you," Carter said carefully. She gave a small laugh, almost shy. "I've heard a few. Some are true, some are made up. People like stories, Colonel. They make everything bigger than it really is. But some things," he said, "are worth making big." She didn't respond to that. She just lifted her glass again, took a slow sip, and placed it down with quiet grace. Carter's mind drifted back to the years when he had first heard the name Phantom 7. Back then, people would speak of the call sign in quiet tones, as if talking about a ghost who appeared when everything seemed uncertain. Phantom 7 wasn't a name people shouted. It was a name people respected. The woman beside him had no idea how many people had carried strength from hearing about her actions. Or maybe she did know, and simply didn't need the applause. Carter took a slow breath. "You know," he said softly, "some people think Phantom 7 isn't one person. They think it's a group." She smiled knowingly. "I've heard that too. And yet here you are," he said. "Real and quiet." She gave a small nod. "Quiet is nice," she said. Something in the way she said it made him feel the weight of all the things she must have experienced, not in detail, but in emotion. She had carried things silently, probably for years. The Colonel wasn't the kind of man who was easily impressed, but right then, he felt a deep sense of respect that words could not fully express. She noticed the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with genuine admiration. It made her feel a little uneasy, though not in a bad way. She wasn't used to being recognized. "Colonel," she said gently, "I don't want to be treated any differently. Not here, not anywhere." "I know," he replied. "I can tell." She gave a soft laugh. "Good. Then we'll just be to people having a drink." He raised his glass slightly. "To quiet nights," he said. She lifted hers too. "To quiet nights," she echoed. They both took a sip, and for a while, they didn't talk. The silence wasn't empty. It was comfortable. It was the kind of silence that existed when two people understood something, without needing to explain it. Carter finally asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind. "What was it like?" She turned toward him slowly. "What was what like?" "Carrying a name like Phantom 7, he said. "Knowing everyone talks about you without ever seeing your face." She thought for a long moment before answering. "Strange," she said simply. Sometimes it felt like they were talking about someone else, like I was listening to a story about a person who didn't even exist. I think I liked it that way. It made it easier to stay invisible. Why would you want to stay invisible? He asked softly. She looked down at her hands, fingers wrapped around her glass. Because attention can be loud, and loud things fade fast. Quiet things last longer. Carter nodded slowly, letting her words settle in his mind. She wasn't just a name. She was someone who had chosen a path where recognition didn't matter. What mattered was doing what needed to be done, quietly, without expecting anything in return. You know, Carter said gently, some people build their whole lives trying to be remembered. But I think people like you end up being remembered the most, even when you're not trying. She gave a quiet, almost shy smile. Maybe stories just travel on their own. A small group of younger Marines walked into the bar at that moment, their laughter bright and full of energy. They ordered drinks loudly, joking with one another, completely unaware of the woman sitting quietly at the corner. One of them looked toward Carter and recognized him. "Hey, Colonel," the young Marine called out, waving cheerfully. Carter lifted his hand in greeting. The young Marine didn't notice her. None of them did. She was used to that. She liked it that way. Carter turned back to her. "They have no idea," he said softly. She shook her head with a gentle smile. "And they don't need to." He looked at her for a long moment, trying to understand how someone who had done so much could be so at peace with being unseen. But then, maybe that was the very thing that made her who she was. "You must have given everything," Carter said softly. She didn't answer right away. She stared at her drink, then finally said, "We all give something. Some just give quietly." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. They were the kind of words that stayed in a person's heart long after the conversation was over. The colonel realized that he wasn't just speaking to a legend. He was speaking to a human being who had walked through moments the world would never fully know about, and she didn't want the world to know. That was her choice. "Can I tell you something?" Carter asked. She looked up at him. "Of course. I'm glad I met you," he said sincerely. "Not Phantom 7, you?" She smiled softly. "That's nice to hear, Colonel." "Thank you. You can call me Carter," he said with a small grin. She chuckled. "All right, Carter." Their conversation drifted after that, away from call signs and stories and legends. They talked about simple things, about places they liked, about books, about how the ocean sounded different at night than it did in the morning. She spoke slowly, carefully, choosing her words like someone who had spent a lifetime observing before speaking. Carter found himself listening more than talking, and strangely, he didn't mind. At some point, the bartender came over and quietly refilled their glasses. Neither of them had noticed how much time had passed. The night outside had grown darker, the street quieter, the world slower. "Do you ever miss it?" Carter asked gently. She thought about it. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but not in the way people think. I don't miss the noise. I don't miss the pressure. I miss the stillness before everything began. The quiet before the storm." Carter nodded. He understood that in his own way. She looked toward the window, watching the soft glow of streetlights outside. Her eyes had a faraway look, like someone who carried many untold stories. She didn't need to tell them for him to know they were there, you know, she said softly. "People spend their lives trying to prove themselves. I spent mine trying not to be seen." "Funny, isn't it?" He smiled gently. "Not funny, just real." For a while, neither of them spoke. The bar grew quieter as the night stretched on. People began to leave, one by one. The young Marines had already gone, laughing as they disappeared down the street. The bartender began to wipe the counter slowly, but didn't rush them. It was clear they were having a rare kind of conversation, one that didn't need noise to be important. Carter finished his drink and set the empty glass down. "You ever think about telling your story someday?" he asked carefully. She shook her head with a faint smile. "No, my story isn't the kind that needs to be told." "I disagree," Carter said softly. "I think it already has been told. Just not by you." She laughed quietly. "Maybe that's enough," he nodded. "Maybe it is." She stood up slowly. reaching for the old leather jacket that had hung loosely on the back of her chair. The jacket had creases and faded marks, the kind that only time could create. It was more than just something to wear. It was a piece of her history. As she slipped it on, Carter realized that she wasn't just leaving the bar. She was disappearing the same way she probably always had, quietly, without leaving a trace. She turned toward him. "It was nice talking to you, Carter," she said softly. He rose to his feet out of respect. "The honor was mine," he said sincerely. She smiled, the kind of smile that said a lot without needing words, before she turned to leave. Carter said quietly, "Phantom 7. She paused, looked back, and gave a small nod. "Don't say that too loud," she whispered with a playful glint in her eye. He chuckled. "I won't." And just like that, she walked out into the night. No dramatic goodbye, no big gesture, just the soft sound of the door closing behind her. Carter watched through the window as she stepped into the street. The breeze caught the edges of her jacket as she walked, her figure slowly blending with the quiet city lights. It was as if the world had swallowed her whole, just like a phantom, inside the bar. Everything slowly returned to normal. The bartender continued cleaning. The music played softly, but Carter knew that something inside him had changed. He sat back down, staring at the spot where she had been just a moment ago. He felt a strange mix of calm and inspiration. He had met someone unforgettable, not because she tried to be, but because